Welcome to this course on ACCA paper F1, The Accountant in Business. Before we get started with looking at the details of the course, it's a good idea in this paper just to spend a little bit of time thinking about what the paper is actually there to test. In other words, what the aim of the paper is. Why does ACCA feel that you should be studying these particular topics? Well, first of all, it says the aim of the paper is to introduce knowledge and understanding. There is going to be a lot of theory in this particular paper, lots of things for you to learn about how businesses operate, how people operate together. Now, the idea behind this is it says to introduce knowledge and understanding of a business. The idea is that you are doing paper F1, F2 and F3. So you're doing a paper about financial accounting, paper F3, management accounting, paper F2, and paper F1, which is about management. Now, if you're not doing F2 and F3 yet, either it's because you've got exempted from them, because you've obviously studied them somewhere else, or perhaps you're going to leave them till later. But the idea is that these three papers fit together. Now, remember, you are doing a professional qualification. You're at the start of your studies, but when you are finished, and it may seem a long time away, but you will get there eventually. When you are finished, you will be a qualified accountant. Now, if you go round and say to somebody, what does an accountant actually do? Most people say, well, they do things like preparing income statements. They will prepare the accounts that people use when they are running a business. Now, that's mainly what you're going to be doing in paper F3. You're going to be preparing accounts that go to shareholders. And as you'll see in the F3 course that you will do with Francis, you'll see there's a lot of things in there about how you prepare accounts. You'll start with debits and credits and build up a complicated set of accounts that tells the story of how a business has done during a year and says where it is at the end of the year. So that's your financial accounting. But one of the things that many accountants also do is they prepare information to be used inside the organisation to help it to be run better. And that's what you do in paper F2 with Rob. So when you do management accounting, when you do paper F3, all you worry about is, we have made a purchase, have we paid for it? Do we still owe the money? We have made a sale, have we received the cash? That's all that F3 is worried about. Whereas in F2, what you then start worrying about is, were we spending money that perhaps we weren't supposed to? Were we spending more money on raw materials than we should have done? When we've got a sale, have we exceeded our sales targets or are we behind them? If we are not spending too much money, if we are not receiving enough in sales revenue, what exactly are we going to do? So if we're spending too much, what are we going to do to fix that? And that's what also an awful lot of accountants do. So if you speak to somebody and you say, I am trained to be an accountant, they will almost certainly say to you, so you like numbers. Now, F2 and F3 are obviously very, very important papers. But the vast bulk of the time, when you are working as an accountant, you're actually not doing either of those two things. You're going to be dealing with people. One of the biggest things that you will need to do when you are a qualified accountant is to manage other people. You'll be there to manage staff. You will have to look at things like, who are you going to recruit to join your particular section? What training are they going to need? How are you going to motivate them to get the best out of them? And how are you going to lead them? In other words, this is exactly the kind of material that we have to study in paper F1. So, yes, you're going to be a qualified accountant. You will obviously do accounting. But a lot of the time, you will be a manager. And so F1 is the introduction to what you need to think about if you are going to manage other people. Now, just like paper F3, the financial accounting paper, leads on to other later papers. It leads on to F7, it leads on to P2, where you get more and more and more and more complicated as far as your financial accounting is concerned. F2 also leads on Say you'll do paper F5, you'll then go on and perhaps do paper P5, which is all about advanced management accounting. With both of these papers, with F2 and F3, you're starting with the basics, and then you're going to make it more complicated. With F1, you do the same thing. The difference is that once you've seen F1, you won't really see very much of it again until you get to paper P3, which will be a little while. When you get to paper P3, we will take everything we've done in paper F1, we'll take it all for granted. It will all be knowledge that you've already got. What we will then do is we'll say, how does it help to run an entire organisation? So in F1, we're looking at the details. Who do you recruit? How do you train them? How do you lead them? How do you put your organisation together? By the time we get to P3, we'll be taking all of those ideas and saying, so how do we take all these things together to make the entire company successful? So the aim of the paper is very much a foundation level. We've got to have an awful lot of knowledge in this particular paper. We are going to take the accounting department and think what exactly its role is. Again, it's something that lots of people take for granted. What do accountants do? They record debits, they record credits, they record who you've sold things to, they record who you've bought things from. But it's actually an awful lot more complicated than that. There is a big role that we are going to be thinking about inside the organisation, which is going to lead through to the final level papers when you are going to be a senior person in the company making important decisions for that company's future. It also talks in here about the fact that we want to run an organisation efficiently. We want to think about how we can run an organisation without spending unnecessary amounts of costs. We need to have an effective organisation. We need to deliver what customers want. We need to deliver what shareholders want. And finally, it talks about the fact it's going to be ethical management. We need to treat people, suppliers, customers in an ethical way. We need to treat them fairly. So we take all of these ideas, and in F1 we're going to look at lots and lots of details about how you need to run an organisation. Now, underneath that you can see there is an outline of the syllabus, and there are 6 basic areas. It talks about things like structure, how we put the organisation together, what kind of departments we have. Governance, how the organisation is actually run, who makes the decisions and how they do them. That's very much thinking about the big picture for an organisation. We are going to leave that until later on in the course. Another big picture, looking at what goes on in the outside world, the environment, and thinking about how it influences what businesses do. Again, we will get to that later on in the course. So a very big thing that you talk about in F1, and you see again in paper P3, is thinking what is changing in the outside world that will affect our organisation. And then, what are we going to do about it? So in F1, we are looking at what affects the organisation. In P3, we then take that on and say, and what are we going to do to respond to it? We'll talk a little bit about the history and the role of accounting. I've already mentioned that. It talks also about accounting and internal financial control. That will link up very heavily with paper F2 and paper F3. So what's the accounting department actually going to do? How does it help to make an organisation be run more efficiently? Final couple of bits we will do is basically to do with people. And these are the bits that we're going to begin with when we start the course a little bit later on. We're going to talk about individuals. We're going to talk about teams. We're going to talk about managing them. So we'll have different chapters where we look at each of those. We will also start by the fact we're going to recruit people, and then we're going to develop them. So we're going to start at the end of that list by looking at individual people. Then we're going to work our way up that list till eventually we're talking about the big picture. We're talking about an entire organisation and trying to see what it does. Final thing I just need to mention at this stage, talking about this introduction, is the format of the exam. Now, as some of you will know, papers F1, F2 and F3 are examined in a slightly different way. All of the papers from F4 onwards are basically examined twice a year with a written paper-based exam. In other words, you go off to a big exam hall, you are told when the exam is going to take place, and you sit exactly the same exam as people all over the world. F1, F2 and F3 are slightly different. You can do the examination like that if you want to. So there is nothing to stop you enrolling and doing the exam in December or in June at an exam centre, and you will get the same exam as everybody else does. Most students, however, choose not to do it like that. What they decide to do is they decide to do the exam on a computer. Now, the great thing about that is obviously you can do the exam whenever you want to. Now, the only downside about that is that although the format of the exam paper is the same for everybody, you can see there it says there are a mixture of 2-mark questions and 1-mark questions. There will basically be normally be round about 40 to 45 questions in the exam. There'll be a mixture, as it says there, of 2-mark ones and 1-mark questions. The thing is that because it's a computer-based exam, everybody gets a slightly different exam paper. What the ACCA do is they have a bank of about 500 questions altogether, and then the computer chooses questions at random. So, some of you will have slightly different question papers to others. Now, that means that you need to have a knowledge of the entire syllabus. It's not like some of the other papers. When you get to F4 onwards, in some of the papers you don't actually need to know everything. You need to know certain key areas. And there might be an area it was examined on the last exam, so we can be relatively confident it's not going to be examined in great detail on the next exam. With F1, F2 and F3, all the exams are going to be different. So you need to know about the entire syllabus. As far as F1 is concerned, it is also a technical exam. And by technical, what I mean is there's going to be quite a lot of technical language that we're using. It's not technical like F2 and F3 are. F2 is technical because you have to be able to do things like calculating variances in particular ways. F3 is technical. You have to be able to do things like calculating the depreciation accurately for an organisation, for a situation. F1 is different. There aren't going to be any calculations, but they expect you to understand what particular words mean, and they might be used in a very specific way. Now, I have taught paper F1 a lot, and the biggest problem that students have with paper F1 is simply the language that is used, particularly if English is not your first language. So if English is not your first language, one of the things that you must do is to make sure you are happy with the way that words and phrases are used in this particular exam paper, because they might be used in a different way to the way that you would use them in ordinary language. They may perhaps even have particular words that they use in the exam questions that you wouldn't come across in real life, or at least you wouldn't come across it in everyday life. That's perhaps a better way of saying it. So if English is not your first language, you need to practice to make sure that you're happy with the way that language is used in the exams. So we're going to have lots of technical language. We're going to have a knowledge of the entire syllabus. Now, it means that exam questions can basically be various different kinds. The most basic kind of question is a straightforward knowledge test. So the examiner will say, here is something, tell me what it means. So here is a definition, tell me, or here is a phrase, tell me the correct definition. Or the examiner might even give you 4 definitions and say, what have I just defined for you? So a lot of the questions that you will get in your exam will be straightforward knowledge. As I've said earlier, the trouble is this is a very big syllabus. It covers a lot of material. You need to be happy with all of that syllabus, which is a tricky thing to do, and there will be no shortcut, I'm afraid, except you've got to study and learn lots of things. The other kind of question that you get is where you apply your knowledge. So, for example, imagine that you have been studying recruitment, which is one of the things that we're going to look at later on. We will look at, for example, in theory, why would you choose an internal candidate, somebody who already works for the company? Why might you choose an external candidate, get them from outside? There's the knowledge, there's the theory. But when you come to doing an exam question, the examiner might ask you a question where he says, here is the situation. You have got a company, this is what they do, this is what they're looking for. Do you think they should get an outside person or an inside person? So in other words, you'll be asked to apply your knowledge and to give your opinion. It will still be a multiple choice question. So you won't be able to write out all of your explanations. You'll simply have to say, that's the closest one that I can find. That's the closest to my answer. So you will have to understand the knowledge as well as simply learning it. You'll have to be able to apply it as well as simply having all the facts. So we're going to have a knowledge of the entire syllabus. We're going to have some technical language. So what is the best way to actually practice and prepare for the exam? Well, obviously, one thing that you've got to do, as I've already said, is you've got to learn the material. I'm afraid there is no shortcut for that. You also have to practice the application of the material. So what you will need to do is you'll need to look at companies you are familiar with. Maybe companies you work for, companies that you see advertised, companies that you see articles about in the paper. Think about who they would recruit, how they would motivate people, how should their business be put together, what things in the outside world will affect their businesses. In other words, practice using the material. I would also suggest that going along with that, a good idea to do would be to read the financial press. Now, the reason why you would do that, 2 reasons. First of all, if you read the financial press, you will get used to the language that they use, which is very important in this paper. Secondly, we'll get used to applying the various different ideas, both of which are key skills if you want to pass this particular exam. So get used to reading the financial press. Obviously, because the exam is in English, it would make sense to read an English language newspaper to do this. Now, I presume that for many of you doing this particular course, you'll be in countries where perhaps English is not the first language. By all means, read local press because they will focus on local companies that you're familiar with, but also try and read something from the British press as well. Now, obviously, that means it's going to be difficult for you, I fully appreciate this, to actually get hold of a newspaper, but there are plenty of resources online that are particularly useful. Some of the big British papers that have online websites that you could go and look at would include things like the Sunday Times in the UK, would include things like the Observer in the UK, the Independent on Sunday, the Sunday Telegraph. All of these are Sunday newspapers. I recommend a Sunday newspaper simply because on a Sunday, the UK press usually use that day's newspapers to sum up what's happened during the week. So they often can go into things in a lot more detail. And all of those newspapers I've just mentioned all have very good business sections on a Sunday. So you could read through and look at what UK companies are doing. Again, making sure that you're happy with the language that's being used. But also, it will give you some ideas about how to apply the knowledge that you are getting. So I'd recommend that you look those up on a website, put them into a search engine, and then try and read those papers, even if you can't read it every week, maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, again, just to get some practice, because it will definitely help you in your exam preparation. So you need to learn the material, practice the application, read the financial presses. The final thing that I will just mention as far as papers F1, F2 and F3 is concerned is remembering that it's a computer exam, remembering that you will get a slightly different exam paper to everybody else. You also, of course, get the advantage that you can sit the examination whenever you want to. So obviously, unlike the examinations which only take place once every 6 months in June and December, as soon as you feel you are ready for this paper, you can then sit it. If for some reason you're not successful, you can sit it again immediately. You could actually turn around and sit the exam later on in the same day if you wanted to. And you can attempt it as many times as you want. Now, there is only one slight exception to that rule. Some of you will have enrolled as what are called mature students. Now, you will know that that's what you have enrolled as because on your entry slips that you get from the ACCA, on your registration information, it will say that you are a mature student. The mature student route for ACCA simply means that you have to be over 21, but you don't need to have any educational qualifications at all. Now, if you have gone down that route and you are entered as a mature student, just be slightly careful. You are not allowed to sit the F1 exam until you have passed the F2 and the F3 exams. So you just need to be slightly careful about that. The reason behind that is if you're going to train to be an accountant, the ACCA in effect will say, we will let anybody start studying, but to make sure that you've got some kind of aptitude, to make sure you're going to have some kind of chance of success, we will make you do the entry-level financial accounting exam and the entry-level management accounting exam first. Make sure you can pass those to make sure you've got the necessary aptitude to perhaps be an accountant, and then we'll let you do paper F1 afterwards. So just be slightly careful about that when you're entering for your exams. So we have seen, just in this introduction, that it's a very much a introductory level paper. There's going to be lots of facts, but there is a reason behind all these facts. The reasons are going to be we want to understand how businesses work so that we can make them more efficient. We want to understand what makes people work so we can work in a better organisation. And you'll see those two coming through over and over and over again as we go through the course.